The replacements arrived on a Tuesday, trudging up the muddy track that served as our main supply route. They always came in a group, a sad little gaggle of green uniforms and wide, terrified eyes, looking like a flock of lost sheep stumbling into a wolf's den. There were 5 of them this time, fresh from the States, their boots not yet broken in, their faces still holding the plump, well-fed look of home. To a man like me, who had been eating K-rations and sleeping in holes for the better part of 2 years, they looked like aliens. They were a reminder of a world that no longer existed for us, a world of clean sheets and hot meals and girls who didn't smell of gunpowder and fear. My name is Sergeant Frank Miller, call sign Sarge, a name as original as mud. I was in charge of 3rd Squad, 1st Platoon, Charlie Company. We were part of the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, and we were currently getting chewed to pieces in a godforsaken patch of German woods called the Hurtgen Forest. It was November 1944. The rain hadn't stopped in a month, and the whole world had been reduced to shades of gray and brown, a miserable, dripping purgatory of shattered trees and endless mud. Patton was racing across France somewhere to the south, but here, in the Hurtgen, the war wasn't a race. It was a slugging match in the dark, a bloody, inch-by-inch grind against an enemy who was dug in, desperate, and damn good at his job. I watched the new men file in, my gut twisting into its familiar knot of resentment and dread. Replacements were a curse. They were walking ghosts. They didn't know how to move, how to listen, how to smell the air for the telltale scent of a German cooking fire. They didn't know the difference between the whistle of an incoming screaming Mimi and one of our own artillery shells. They were loud, clumsy, and they got good men killed. My job was to keep them alive long enough for them to learn, but the Hurtgen wasn't a good school. It was a slaughterhouse. The platoon sergeant, a grizzled old-timer named O'Malley, pointed one of them in my direction. "Miller, this one's yours. Name's Bishop, Daniel Bishop." I looked the kid over. He couldn't have been more than 18. He was tall and skinny, with a long neck and big hands that seemed too large for his body. He had a shock of sandy blonde hair sticking out from under his helmet and a pair of wide, earnest blue eyes that were taking in the scene of devastation around him with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He was clutching his M1 Garand like it was a holy relic, his knuckles white. "Bishop," I grunted, not bothering to get up from the log I was sitting on. "Ever been in the woods before, Bishop?" "Yes, Sergeant," he said, his voice a nervous squeak. "Back home in Ohio. My father's a preacher. We'd have church picnics in the state park." I almost laughed. Church picnics. He might as well have said he'd been to the moon. A couple of the veterans from my squad, guys who had survived North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy with me, chuckled darkly. Rizzo, a fast-talking kid from Brooklyn who handled our bar, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the kid's boots. "You ain't in Ohio anymore, preacher." The kid, Bishop, flinched but didn't say anything. He just stood there, a picture of misery in his too clean uniform. "Well, welcome to Germany," I said, my voice flat and hard. "There ain't no picnics here. Find a hole, keep your head down, and try not to get yourself or anyone else killed. Your first lesson, the man next to you is more important than you are. You forget that, you're dead. You understand?" "Yes, Sergeant," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. I dismissed him with a wave of my hand. I had more important things to worry about, like the rumor of a German counterattack and the fact that my socks had rotted through 2 days ago. The kid was a liability, a walking bullseye. The best I could do was stick him in a hole and hope a stray piece of shrapnel found him before his incompetence found one of my veterans. It was a cruel thought, but the Hurtgen was a cruel place. It stripped away everything that wasn't essential for survival, and compassion was one of the first things to go. The first test came 2 days later. A short, brutal firefight over a muddy crossroads that meant nothing to us, but was apparently important enough for a bunch of men to die for. It was the kid's first taste of combat, his baptism by fire. And he failed, miserably. The moment the first German machine gun opened up, a dreaded MG-42 that we called Hitler's buzzsaw, Bishop froze. He just stood there, out in the open, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't even trying to take cover. He was a statue of pure terror. "Get down, you damn fool!" I screamed, but he didn't move. The air was alive with cracking, snapping sounds as the bullets ripped past him. It was a miracle he wasn't hit. I did something stupid. Something a sergeant with my experience should never have done. I left my cover, a half-submerged shell crater, and ran to him. I tackled him, driving him face-first into the cold, stinking mud. We lay there for a second, the MG-42 chewing up the ground where he had just been standing. I could feel him trembling under me, his whole body shaking with violent, uncontrollable spasms. I hauled him to his feet and shoved him towards the relative safety of a fallen log. "Stay here and don't move until I tell you to," I roared over the din of the battle. He just stared at me, his face a pale, mud-streaked mask of shock. He hadn't fired a single round. His rifle was still clean. We took the crossroads. It cost us 2 men. 2 good men, veterans of the Normandy hedgerows. And it was his fault. If he had been firing, adding his rifle to the volume of our suppressive fire, maybe that German machine gunner would have kept his head down. Maybe Thompson and Garcia would still be alive. The maybes were poison. They ate at you, rotted you from the inside out. After the fight, when we were back in our holes, counting our dead and licking our wounds, I found him. He was sitting by himself, cleaning his rifle with a meticulous, obsessive care, as if trying to scrub away his failure. I stood over him, my shadow falling across him. He looked up, his eyes filled with a miserable shame. I'm sorry, Sergeant," he stammered. I froze. I didn't know what to do. "You know what you did, kid," I said, my voice low and shaking with a cold fury. "You got 2 men killed. Thompson had a wife and a new baby daughter he'd never seen. Garcia was sending his pay home to his mother in Texas so she could buy a farm. They're dead. Because you stood there with your thumb up your ass, sightseeing." Tears welled up in his eyes and began to trace clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. I prayed. I prayed for courage, but prayed. I spat the word out like it was poison. "You think God has time for you right now? You think he's picking sides in this goddamn mess? Let me tell you something, preacher. The only thing that's going to save you out here is the 8 rounds in your rifle and the man next to you. And you let both of them down today." I kicked a clod of dirt at his feet. "You're a burden, Bishop. A walking death sentence. Stay away from me. Stay away from my men. You're poison." I walked away, leaving him there with his tears and his useless prayers. The other men in the squad got the message. They shunned him. They wouldn't share a foxhole with him. They wouldn't speak to him. He was an outcast, a pariah. In the brutal, unforgiving society of a combat squad, there was no greater punishment. He was utterly, completely alone. He took the abuse without a word. He did the worst jobs without complaint. He dug latrines. He filled sandbags. He took the last shift on guard duty. And he prayed. I'd see him sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, his head bowed, his lips moving silently. It made me sick. It was a sign of weakness, a crutch for a man who couldn't face the reality of what this war was. The reality was that God had left the Hurtgen Forest a long, long time ago. All that was left was us and the Germans and the endless, killing rain. My mind was made up. The kid was a danger to the squad. He had proven it. He was going to get more men killed. And I wasn't going to let that happen. The next time we went into a real fight, the next time the stakes were high, I was going to find a way to get rid of him. I wouldn't shoot him myself, of course. But there were other ways. A dangerous reconnaissance patrol. A volunteer mission to scout a minefield. War offered 1,000 opportunities to lose a man you didn't want. It was a dark, ugly thought, but it was a practical one. It was my job to make the hard decisions. And getting rid of Private Daniel Bishop was a decision that would save lives. That was a sin I was more than willing to live with. Lieutenant Davies was a good kid, but he was greener than Bishop's uniform had been a week ago. He'd graduated from West Point in 1943, a 90-day wonder who had learned about war from textbooks and sand tables. He had a map, a compass, and a whole lot of theory, but he didn't have the one thing that mattered: the smell. He couldn't smell the difference between safe silence and ambush silence. He couldn't smell the damp rot in the air that told you a corpse was nearby. He looked at the map and saw contour lines and objectives. I looked at the same map and saw kill zones and meat grinders. He called the squad leaders to his command post, which was just a slightly deeper hole in the ground covered with a leaky poncho. The rain was coming down in a steady, miserable drizzle, tapping on the poncho like a drumbeat counting down the seconds of our lives. Davies had a flashlight trained on his map, the beam making a small, bright circle of impending doom. All right, men, he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice was tight. Battalion wants us to take Hill 382. It's a key observation point overlooking the Kaul River Valley. Intelligence says it's lightly held. A few machine gun nests, maybe a mortar or two. We move out at 1,400 hours. I stared at the map. Hill 382. It was a nasty-looking piece of real estate, a steep, pine-choked hogback ridge that rose out of the forest like a bony spine. The Germans weren't stupid. They wouldn't leave a key observation point lightly held. They'd have it zeroed in with every piece of artillery they owned. It was a suicide mission, a textbook example of what the GIs were calling the Hurtgen meat grinder. Command wanted the hill, so they were going to feed us into the grinder, one platoon at a time, until the gears clogged with our bodies. Lightly held? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that the same intelligence that said the Siegfried Line would be a walkover? Davies flushed, the pale skin of his face turning red in the flashlight's glow. I'm just giving you the information I was given, Sergeant. Our orders are to take that hill. 1st and 2nd platoons will provide a base of fire while Charlie Company assaults. He was trying to sound like a commander, but he just sounded like a kid reciting a lesson. He was going to get us all killed. Sir, I said, keeping my voice level, respectful, but with an edge of steel that I knew he would hear. That's a frontal assault up a steep, wooded slope against an entrenched enemy. We'll be cut to pieces before we get halfway. Do you have a better idea, Sergeant Miller? He asked, his jaw tightening. I did. It was a terrible idea, a long shot, but it was better than a suicide charge. We need eyes on the far side of that ridge, I said, tapping the map. On the reverse slope. That's where their main force will be, their mortars, their reserves. If we walk in blind, they'll let us take the forward slope and then slaughter us when we're exposed on the crest. I need a man to circle around, get to the top of this hogback here. I pointed to a smaller, adjacent ridge and put a field telephone down. If he can see what's behind Hill 382, we'll at least know what kind of hell we're walking into. Davies considered it. He was a bad lieutenant, but he wasn't a stupid one. He knew I was right. It's a two-man job, at least, he said. It's a long way around their flank. Who would you send? And that's when the devil on my shoulder whispered in my ear. It was the perfect opportunity. The solution to my Bishop problem delivered on a silver platter. The route I had pointed out was a long, lonely trek through the darkest, most dangerous part of the forest. It was a one-way ticket. I looked the lieutenant straight in the eye. It's a one-man job, sir. A two-man team makes twice the noise. We need someone quiet. Someone who won't be missed if he doesn't make it. My gaze flickered over to where my squad was huddled under the dripping trees. Bishop was sitting by himself, as usual, reading a small, worn Bible that he kept in his breast pocket. He looked small and pathetic. An acceptable loss. I'll send the new kid, I said. Bishop, Davies frowned. The replacement? The one who froze up at the crossroads? You want to send him out there alone? That's exactly why I want to send him, I said, my voice cold. He's a liability in a firefight. He's a danger to the rest of the squad. Out there, on his own, the only life he's risking is his own. It's a simple reconnaissance mission. All he has to do is crawl up a hill, hook up a phone, and tell us what he sees. If he can't even do that, then he's no use to us anyway. And if he gets lost, well, we're one less burden to worry about. It was a cruel, callous piece of logic. I was sentencing a man to death, but in the twisted morality of the Hurtgen, it made a kind of sense. I was sacrificing one man to potentially save 17. It was a trade I was willing to make. Davies was uneasy, but he was also out of his depth. He was leaning on my experience, and I was leading him down a dark path. He chewed on his lip for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. All right, Sergeant, if you think it's the best way. But if he doesn't report in, we go ahead with the main assault as planned. Understood, sir, I said. I walked back over to my squad. The men looked at me, their faces questioning. They had heard the conversation. They knew what I was doing. No one said a word. They were survivors. They understood the brutal math of our existence. I stopped in front of Bishop. He looked up from his Bible, his blue eyes wide and questioning. He closed the book and put it carefully back in his pocket, as if it might protect him. On your feet, preacher, I said. He scrambled up, his lanky frame unfolding awkwardly. You're going on a little hike, I told him, my voice devoid of all emotion. You see that ridge over there? I pointed into the gloom. You're going to take this. I tossed him a spool of telephone wire and a field phone. And you're going to crawl to the top of it. You're going to find a spot where you can see the other side of that big hill in front of us. Then you're going to hook this phone up and you're going to call me and tell me what you see. You do not engage the enemy. You do not fire your weapon unless you have no other choice. You are a ghost. You understand? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He looked at the spool of wire, then at the dark, menacing forest. I was sending him into the belly of the beast. We both knew it. Yes, Sergeant, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Good, I said. I turned to walk away, but he spoke again. Sergeant. I stopped, but didn't turn around. What? Why me? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. I turned then and looked him right in the eye. I gave him the honest, brutal truth. Because I don't trust you in a firefight. Because you're a danger to my men. And because, quite frankly, Bishop, I don't expect to see you again. Now get your gear and move out. I watched him as he gathered his equipment. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely buckle his ammo belt. He slung the heavy spool of wire over his shoulder, picked up his rifle, and gave one last, lost look at the rest of the squad. No one would meet his gaze. He was already a dead man. He turned and walked away, a solitary figure melting into the green-gray gloom of the forest. The telephone wire unspooled behind him, a thin, black umbilical cord connecting him to a world that had already cast him out. Rizzo came up beside me, a fresh plug of tobacco in his cheek. That's cold, Sarge, he said quietly. Real cold. It's war, Rizzo, I said, watching the last of the wire disappear into the trees. He was a liability. Now he's recon. But as I walked back to my hole to wait for a phone call I never expected to receive, I couldn't shake a cold, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't guilt. I was long past feeling guilty about the things I had to do to keep my men alive. It was something else. A flicker of doubt. I had just passed judgment on a man's life based on a single moment of fear. I was playing God. And in the Hurtgen forest, that was a dangerous game to play. I was just clearing my conscience before the slaughter. The hour after Bishop disappeared into the forest was the longest of my life. It was a dead space in time, filled with the quiet, personal rituals that men perform when they know they're about to walk into the fire. Some men wrote letters, their pencils scratching furiously on V-mail forms, trying to cram a lifetime of unspoken words into a few short paragraphs. Others cleaned their weapons with a religious devotion, stripping them down and reassembling them until the metallic click-clack was a prayer against malfunction. Tex sat with his back against a tree stump, honing his bayonet on a whetstone. The rhythmic shhhk of steel on stone, a grating, nerve-wracking sound. Rizzo chain-smoked cigarettes, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a twitchy, feral energy. I did none of those things. I studied the map, even though I had already memorized every contour line, every symbol for marshy ground, every penciled in X that marked a suspected enemy position. I was looking for something that wasn't there. An escape route, a hidden path, an answer. The map offered none. It was just paper and ink, a cold, indifferent diagram of our impending doom. My job wasn't to hope, it was to plan, to take the impossible order and break it down into a series of manageable, survivable steps. But no matter how I looked at it, the final step was always the same, a bloody, headlong charge into the teeth of dug-in machine guns. Guilt was a luxury, a peacetime emotion. But as I stared at the thin black telephone wire snaking its way out from our position and disappearing into the woods, I felt a cold sliver of something that tasted like it. I had condemned a man to death. I told myself it was for the good of the squad. I told myself it was a necessary sacrifice. But the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I had used the kid's faith, his earnest desire to do good, as a weapon against him. It was a sin. And even for a man like me who hadn't seen the inside of a church in 20 years, it felt like it. I pushed the thought down, buried it under a layer of cold, hard pragmatism. He was gone. He was no longer my problem. My problem was the 17 men who were still breathing, who were looking to me to get them through the next few hours. At 1,350 hours, I gave the signal. Saddle up. The words dropped into the tense silence like stones into a pond. The men moved with a weary reluctance, shrugging into their gear, hoisting their weapons. They checked each other's equipment, tightening straps, passing spare clips of ammo. It was a silent, intimate dance of brotherhood, a final acknowledgement of their reliance on one another. Lieutenant Davies emerged from his hole, his face pale but set. He'd put on a brave face, but his eyes betrayed him. They were the eyes of a man walking to his own execution. "First squad on point," he ordered, his voice cracking slightly. "Sergeant Miller, your squad will follow. Third squad in reserve. Maintain 5-yard spacing. No talking. We move on my signal." He looked at me. "Ready, Sergeant?" I just nodded. Words were pointless now. The signal came, a sharp blast on a whistle, and we moved. We slipped out of our trenches like ghosts, melting into the perpetual gloom of the Hurtgen. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick mud, rotting leaves, and tangled roots that seemed to grab at your ankles. Every step was a struggle. Water squelched in our boots. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of pine rot and death. Above us, the canopy of the fir trees was so thick that it blocked out what little light the November sky had to offer, plunging us into a green-tinged twilight. We moved slowly, cautiously. This was the deadliest part of any advance. A single misplaced boot on a dry twig could sound like a rifle shot in the stillness. A cough could give away your position to a German listening post. We were hunters, but we were also the hunted. Every shadow could hold a sniper. Every fallen log could hide a machine gun nest. The tension was a physical thing, a tight band around my chest that made it hard to breathe. I scanned the trees, my M1 held at the ready, my finger resting on the trigger guard. My eyes burned from the strain of trying to pierce the shadows. We passed the point where I estimated Bishop would have been. I glanced over at the hogback ridge to our left. It was a dark, menacing shape through the trees, a place of profound silence. I wondered if he'd made it. I wondered if he was already dead, lying in the mud with a German bullet in him. The thought was a fleeting one, quickly dismissed. He was a ghost. A problem solved. We advanced for what felt like an eternity, but my watch told me it was only 20 minutes. We'd covered maybe 300 yards. So far, nothing. The silence was the worst part. It was unnatural. A forest should have noises, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals. But the Hurtgen was silent, save for the drip of water and the squelch of our own boots. The Germans had a name for it, Totentanz, the dance of death. It was a silence that screamed of ambush. "Something's not right," Evans whispered, moving up beside me. He moved through the woods with a farmer's economy of motion, silent and sure-footed. "It's too quiet, even for this place." "I know," I breathed back. "It's a welcome party. They're waiting for us to knock." We reached a small stream, a muddy trickle of black water cutting through the forest floor. The point squad was already across, fanning out on the other side. This was the line of departure. The base of Hill 382 was just ahead, a steep, ugly slope choked with shattered trees and undergrowth. We were on the doorstep. Lieutenant Davies gave the signal to halt. He crawled up to me, his map shaking in his hand. "Intel says there's a line of abandoned trenches about 50 yards up the slope," he whispered. "We take those, consolidate, and then push for the summit. First and second squads will lead the assault. Third will provide covering fire." It was a textbook plan, a plan that would work perfectly on a training field in Georgia. Here, it was a recipe for disaster. But it was the only plan we had. "All right, boys," I whispered to my squad, crawling from man to man. "This is it. Fix bayonets. When we go hard and fast. Don't stop for anything. Get to those trenches. Use your grenades. Go." The lieutenant blew his whistle, a shrill, piercing sound that shattered the silence. And with a ragged cheer that sounded more like a collective groan of despair, we charged. The first 50 yards were a nightmare of exertion. We scrambled up the muddy slope, our boots slipping, our lungs burning. Branches whipped at our faces. The air was suddenly filled with noise, our own desperate panting, the crashing of undergrowth, the clatter of gear. It still felt wrong. There was no return fire. The silence from the German lines was absolute, unnerving. We saw the trenches then, a dark scar zigzagging across the hillside. They looked empty. We were 20 yards away, then 10. My heart was hammering against my ribs. It was a trap. It had to be a trap. Why weren't they shooting? We tumbled into the first trench, one after another, landing in a heap of mud and exhausted limbs. The trench was old, half filled with dirt and water, but it offered cover. For a moment, we just lay there, gasping for air, our bodies screaming in protest. We'd made it. We'd actually made it. A wave of adrenaline-fueled relief washed over me. Maybe, just maybe, intelligence had been right for once. Maybe the position was lightly held. Maybe the main force had pulled back. I risked a look over the parapet. The summit was another 150 yards up a steep, exposed slope. I could see the dark shape of what looked like a concrete pillbox peeking through the shattered trees. Still nothing. All right, I yelled, my voice hoarse. Sound off. Squad leaders, report. The reports came back, ragged and breathless, but positive. No casualties on the way up. We were all here. We were all alive. A dangerous sense of optimism began to spread through the platoon. "See, Sarge," Rizzo said, grinning at me from a few feet away. He had a smudge of mud on his cheek that made him look like a kid playing soldier. Piece of cake. The Krauts must have pulled out. Probably heard we were coming and ran all the way back to Berlin. And that's when all hell broke loose. It started with a sound that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. A slow, ripping sound, like a giant tearing a sheet of canvas. BRRRP, BRRRP, BRRRRP. It was the sound of an MG-42 opening up. Hitler's buzzsaw. It came from our left flank, a position we hadn't seen, a hidden nest that had a perfect enfilading fire position along the length of our trench. The first burst ripped through the air just over our heads, a solid wall of lead that chewed through the trees and sent a shower of splinters and leaves down on us. The bullets made a vicious cracking sound as they passed, a sound that told you how close death really was. Every man in the trench hit the dirt, instinctively burying his face in the mud. The grin was wiped clean from Rizzo's face, replaced by the same slack-jawed terror I'd seen on Bishop's. "Get down. Keep your heads down." I screamed, the order unnecessary. Then came the second one. Another MG-42, this one from the pillbox directly in front of us. Its fire was high, but it was designed to keep us pinned, to prevent us from moving forward or backward. We were caught in a perfect crossfire. The welcome party had arrived, and then the mortars started. They didn't need to range them. They knew exactly where we were. The first shell landed with a sickening thump just behind our trench, a geyser of black earth and steel. The second one landed square in the middle of a section of trench held by 3rd Squad. I heard a scream, a horrible, wet, gurgling sound that was cut short. The air was filled with the smell of cordite and blood. "Medic!" someone screamed. "For God's sake, medic!" Doc Schmidt, our medic, was already moving, crawling through the mud from one wounded man to another, his aid bag clutched in his hand. He was a brave man, but he was only one man. This was the trap. They had let us take the first trench. They had dangled the bait, and like fools, we had swallowed it whole. They'd let us bunch up in this goddamn ditch, and now they were going to slaughter us at their leisure. "Lieutenant," I yelled, crawling towards Davy's position. "Lieutenant, we gotta pull back. We have to get out of here." I found him huddled at the bottom of the trench. He'd been hit. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his shoulder, and his left arm was hanging at a useless angle. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He was out of it. "We can't," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "The order, take the hill." "To hell with the order," I roared, grabbing the front of his jacket. The order was a death sentence. We're being cut to pieces. I'm getting my men out of here. But it was too late. I peeked over the edge of the trench again, a quick, dangerous glance. The MG-42 on the flank had us pinned. There was no way to retreat back down the slope without crossing its field of fire. We were trapped. The trench that had felt like salvation a minute ago was now our coffin. A runner from 1st Squad scrambled over to me, his face wild with panic. "Sergeant, the radio's been hit. It's smashed to pieces. We can't call for support." Of course. No artillery. No communication. We were utterly, completely alone. We were a sacrifice, just as I'd thought. Expendable. A platoon of men thrown away to test the enemy's defenses. The next hour was a blur of noise, fear, and death. The mortars fell with a relentless, terrifying rhythm. The machine guns never stopped their hellish chatter. Snipers began to pick us off, their single, sharp rifle cracks adding a personal, intimate touch to the impersonal slaughter of the machine guns. You'd hear the crack, and a man near you would grunt and slump over, a neat dark hole appearing in his helmet or his chest. Tex, the calm, steady rifleman from Amarillo, decided he'd had enough. "I'm gonna shut that damn buzzsaw up," he yelled, his face a mask of rage. He crawled to the edge of the trench, a grenade in his hand. "Tex, no. Stay down," I shouted. But he was already up, a tall, exposed target. He drew his arm back to throw, and for a split second, I thought he might actually do it. Then I saw a puff of red mist bloom from his chest. He staggered, a look of profound surprise on his face, before collapsing back into the trench. The grenade rolled from his hand. Evans, moving faster than I'd ever seen him, snatched up the grenade and threw it, not at the enemy, but into an empty section of the trench where it exploded harmlessly. He crawled over to Tex, but it was no use. I could see it in his eyes. Tex was gone. The loss hit me like a physical blow. Tex had been with me since Africa. He was part of the platoon's backbone. And now he was just another body in the mud. The optimism of an hour ago was a distant, bitter memory. Now, there was only a grim, desperate struggle to survive from one second to the next. The men were terrified. I could see the 1,000-yard stare creeping into their eyes, the hollow, vacant look of men who have seen too much. Rizzo was curled into a tight ball, muttering prayers in a mixture of English and Italian. Others were just firing blindly over the top of the trench, wasting ammunition, their movements frantic and useless. I crawled up and down the line, slapping helmets, screaming orders, trying to restore some semblance of fire discipline. "Aim your shots. Short bursts. Don't waste your ammo." But it was like trying to shout down a hurricane. Panic was a disease, and it was spreading fast. In the middle of that chaos, in the symphony of destruction, a thought drifted through my mind, unbidden and irrelevant. I thought of Bishop. I thought of the quiet, awkward kid I had sent off to die alone on a godforsaken ridge. I found myself hoping his end had been quick. A single bullet, a single shell. Better that than this. Better than dying slowly, in terror, surrounded by the screams of your friends in a muddy ditch you couldn't escape. Sending him away, I thought with a grim, black irony, might have been the kindest thing I'd ever done. I pushed the thought away. He was dead. He didn't matter. What mattered was the handful of living, breathing men still huddled in this trench with me. The Germans were starting to move. I could hear their officers shouting commands in the lulls between the machine gun bursts. They were forming up for a counterattack, to come down the slope and finish us off with bayonets and grenades. We were low on ammo. We had at least a dozen wounded, probably more. Our officer was out of action. Our radio was gone. We were cut off, surrounded, and about to be overrun. I looked at Evans, his face grimed with mud and gunpowder. He just shook his head slowly. There was nothing left to say. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a heroic charge, but here, trapped in a cold, wet ditch in a forest no one had ever heard of, waiting for an enemy we couldn't see to come and kill us. I gripped my M1, the wood of the stock slick with rain and sweat. I chambered around. If I was going to die, I was going to take some of them with me. But as I peered over the edge of the trench, watching the gray-clad figures of the German infantry starting to move through the trees, I knew it was hopeless. There were too many of them. We were already dead. We just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Death had a face, and it was the smudged, determined face of a young German soldier in a coal scuttle helmet, not 50 yards away, moving from tree to tree. I could see the eagle on his tunic, the strap of his Kar 98K rifle slung across his chest. He was moving with the confidence of a man who knew he was on the winning side. He wasn't alone. Through the shattered tree trunks and the drifting veils of mist, I could see more of them, a whole platoon of grenadiers, fanning out, their movements disciplined and terrifyingly professional. Their NCOs were yelling commands, guttural barks of encouragement that cut through the din of the machine guns. "Vorwärts," mocked Sie Fertig. "Forward. Finish them." This was the end of the line. The final, bloody act. My mind, strangely calm in the face of annihilation, took a final inventory. We had maybe a dozen men still capable of fighting, spread thinly along our section of the trench. The rest were either dead or wounded and moaning in the mud. Lieutenant Davies was propped against the trench wall, his face a ghastly white, trying to stanch the bleeding from his shoulder with a field dressing that was already soaked crimson. Doc Schmidt was out of morphine and nearly out of bandages. Ammunition was critical. I checked my own belt. One full clip of 8 rounds in my Garand, and 2 more in my pocket. 16 rounds. 16 chances to make a German mother weep before I joined Tex in the great beyond. This is it, Evans, I said, my voice strangely detached, as if I were commenting on the weather. I was lying pressed against the forward lip of the trench, the wet earth cold against my cheek. Evans was beside me, his face grim, his knuckles white where he gripped his own rifle. "Looks that way, Frank," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't look scared. He just looked tired. A deep, profound weariness, as if he'd been fighting this war for 1,000 years and was finally ready for it to be over. Been a hell of a run. Get ready to make him pay for every foot, I ordered, my voice finding its familiar bark. I crawled down the line, slapping the helmets of the few men still looking at me. Aim for the officers, the ones yelling. Make every shot count. Every goddamn one. Rizzo, who had been a whimpering ball of fear moments before, looked up at me. The fear was still there, but it was overlaid with a glassy, fatalistic rage. He nodded, his jaw set, and chambered around in his bar. He was going to die, but he was going to die fighting. That was all I could ask of him. The Germans were closing the distance. 40 yards. Their movements were methodical. A group would lay down suppressing fire, while another group rushed forward to the next bit of cover. Classic fire and maneuver. They were good. They were very, very good. The MG-42 on our flank was still hammering away, its fire forcing us to keep our heads down, making it impossible to mount a coordinated defense. The one in the pillbox was firing in long, sweeping bursts, chewing up the ground in front of us. A German NCO, a broad-shouldered man with a prominent mustache and an MP-40 submachine gun cradled in his arms, stepped out from behind a large oak tree. He raised his hand, preparing to signal the final rush. He was the conductor of our funeral march. I centered my sights on his chest. It was a long shot in the poor light, but I was a good shot. I took a steadying breath, letting half of it out, my finger tightening on the trigger. And then, a sound. It was not the deafening roar of the machine guns, nor the crash of a mortar. It was a single, sharp, distinctive crack. A sound I knew as well as my own name. It was the sound of a high-velocity 30-06 round leaving the barrel of an M1 Garand. But it hadn't come from our trench. It had come from somewhere deep in the woods, far off to our left flank. From behind the German lines. The German NCO flinched. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. His MP-40 clattered to the ground. He looked down at his tunic, a comical expression of surprise on his face, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Then his knees buckled, and he pitched forward into the mud. He didn't move again. A stunned silence fell over the advancing German soldiers. They stopped in their tracks, looking around in confusion. Who had fired? Where had it come from? Their well-oiled assault ground to a halt. They looked at our trench, then back towards their own lines. They were exposed, caught in the open between cover. What the hell was that? Rizzo breathed, his eyes wide. "Keep your head down," I snarled, my own mind reeling. Reinforcements? No. It was impossible. We were cut off. The radio was out. No one even knew the full extent of our predicament. Was it another platoon? Maybe the attack on their sector had stalled, and they were trying to flank the German position? It was possible, but the shot had been too clean, too perfect. It wasn't the wild, suppressive fire of a unit in combat. It was the deliberate, aimed shot of a marksman. Before I could process it, it happened again. This time, there was no single rifle crack, but a different sound. A dull thump, followed by a high, arching whistle. It wasn't one of their mortars. It was one of ours. A grenade. It sailed in a perfect arc over the trees and landed with pinpoint accuracy right in the middle of the hidden MG-42 nest on our flank. There was a muffled crump, followed by a series of screams. The relentless, terrifying chatter of Hitler's buzzsaw, the sound that had been nailing us into our coffins for the last hour, abruptly stopped. It was as if someone had simply turned off a switch. The sudden silence from that direction was more shocking than the noise had been. Now the Germans were really confused. They started yelling at each other, their discipline beginning to fray. They were being hit from a direction they didn't expect, from a ghost in the trees. Their officers were trying to restore order, but it's hard to command men who think they're surrounded. I saw my chance. "Pour it on him," I screamed, my voice cracking with a sudden, wild surge of hope. They're confused. Hit him now. My men responded instantly. The flicker of hope was all they needed. Rizzo's bar roared to life, spitting a stream of tracers into the disorganized German ranks. The other riflemen opened up, the cracks of their M1s joining the chorus. We weren't just firing blindly anymore. We were firing at targets, exposed and uncertain German soldiers caught in no man's land. Several of them went down. The rest scrambled for cover, their attack completely broken. But the ghost in the woods wasn't finished. As the Germans fell back in disarray, a new target presented itself. A German Opel Blitz truck, which had been parked behind a cluster of thick trees and was likely carrying reserve ammunition for the mortars, suddenly erupted in a massive fireball. A tremendous hump of an explosion rocked the forest, sending a column of black smoke billowing up into the gray sky. Shrapnel and flaming debris rained down over the German positions. The secondary explosions of the ammunition on board sounded like a string of giant firecrackers. The effect on the Germans was catastrophic. Panic, the disease I had seen spreading among my own men, now infected them. They were no longer soldiers. They were just terrified men caught in a multi-directional kill zone. They were firing wildly now, not at us, but into the woods behind them, shooting at shadows, at a phantom enemy they couldn't see. What in the name of God is happening? Evans said, staring at the burning truck, his face illuminated by the flames. I don't know, I said, my voice filled with a sense of awe and utter disbelief. But I like it. I used the chaos to reorganize. Schmidt, get to the lieutenant. Evans, get a casualty count. Rizzo, keep that bar singing, but watch your ammo. The rest of you, pick your targets. I crawled over to the smashed radio set. It was hopeless, a twisted wreck of metal and wires. There was no calling for help. Whoever was out there, they were on their own. And so were we. This wasn't a coordinated attack. This was something else. Something strange. The battle devolved into a confused, messy firefight. The Germans were no longer attacking. They were defending. They were pinned down, just as we had been, by an unseen enemy in their rear. The mortars had fallen silent, their crews likely scattered or killed by the truck explosion. The flanking MG-42 was out of action. The only major threat left was the pillbox on the summit, and its gunner seemed hesitant, firing in short, uncertain bursts, unsure of where the main threat lay. We had been given a reprieve, a miracle. We were no longer on the brink of annihilation, but we were still trapped. We were still wounded, low on ammo, and deep in enemy territory. This ghost, whoever he was, had saved us from the fire, but we were still in the frying pan. And then I heard it. A small, almost insignificant sound, lost in the general din of combat. But to a man who had lived and breathed the M1 Garand for 2 years, it was as loud and clear as a church bell. Ping. It was the unmistakable sound of an 8-round in-block clip being automatically ejected from an M1 Garand after the last round was fired. The sound came from the woods, from the direction of the Hogback Ridge, from the place I had sent Private Daniel Bishop to die. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. It was impossible. The kid was a preacher's son who froze under fire. He was a skinny, awkward boy who carried his rifle like it was a snake. He couldn't be the ghost. He couldn't be the phantom marksman, the phantom grenadier who had single-handedly broken a German assault and saved a platoon of hardened veterans. It defied all logic. It defied everything I knew about men and war. He was dead. I had sent him on a suicide mission. He had to be dead. It must be someone else. A scout from another company who had gotten lost. A paratrooper from the 101st, separated from his unit. Anyone but him. But the sound, that crisp, metallic ping. It was the song of our rifle, and it had come from his direction. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion. Guilt, which I had so carefully buried, came roaring back to life. If it was him, if that terrified, useless kid had somehow survived and was now out there, fighting a one-man war on our behalf, what did that make me? I had used him. I had thrown him away like a piece of garbage. And he was now, impossibly, saving my life. Frank. Evan's voice cut through my thoughts. He was looking at me, his eyes questioning. You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I couldn't answer. I just stared into the dark woods, towards the ridge. The firefight was still raging, but it had lost its intensity. It was now a sporadic exchange of shots. The Germans were dug in, waiting for whatever was in the woods to show itself. We were doing the same. The burning truck cast a hellish, flickering light over the battlefield. The smoke was thick, acrid. The forest was filled with the screams of wounded men, both American and German. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. And somewhere out there, in the deepest circle of that hell, was the ghost. Our ghost. I crawled back to my position at the edge of the trench, my mind still refusing to accept what my gut was telling me. I looked up the slope towards the German pillbox. The MG-42 inside, it was the linchpin of their defense. As long as it was active, we couldn't move forward, and we couldn't retreat. The ghost had neutralized the other threats, but the pillbox was a hardened target. You couldn't take out a concrete bunker with a rifle. I settled in behind my rifle, my eyes scanning the woods. The German assault was broken, their morale shattered. But they were still here. We were still here. The battle wasn't over. It had just entered a new, stranger phase. We were caught in a stalemate, with a phantom ally tipping the scales. I felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion, hope. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. For the first time in hours, I thought we might actually get out of this alive. And I had a terrifying, humbling suspicion about who we would have to thank. Hold your fire. I ordered my men, my voice low and steady. Conserve your ammunition. Wait for a clear target. We waited. The forest waited with us. And somewhere out in the gloom, I knew the ghost was waiting too, watching, calculating his next move. The fate of my entire platoon rested on the shoulders of an unknown savior, a phantom in the Hurtgenwald. And I was very much afraid that I knew his name. Time ceased to have meaning. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternities, each one measured by the frantic beat of my own heart against the cold, wet earth. The world shrank to the narrow confines of our muddy trench and the 100-yard killing field in front of it. The burning Opel truck was our funeral pyre, casting a grotesque, dancing light on the twisted trees and the still forms that dotted the slope. The thick, oily smoke billowed across the battlefield, a merciful shroud that partially hid us and the enemy from each other. It smelled of burning rubber, gasoline, and cooked meat, a stomach-turning perfume that clung to the back of my throat. The firefight had dwindled to a sporadic, nervous conversation between rifles. A shot from our side, answered by two from theirs. A burst from Rizzo's bar, met with a flurry of angry cracks from the German positions. They were still out there, pinned down like us, caught between our trench and the phantom that haunted their rear. The stalemate was a fragile thing, a bubble of quiet tension that could burst at any moment. The main threat, the heart of the German position, remained untouched. The concrete pillbox on the summit of the hill. Its MG-42 had fallen silent for a few minutes, the gunner likely as confused and terrified as his comrades in the open. But now, it began to speak again. Not in the long, confident bursts of before, but in short, probing sentences of death. BRRRP, BRRRP. A stream of tracers would stitch a line across the smoke-filled woods, searching for the ghost. BRRRP. Another burst would chew up the earth just above our heads, a casual reminder that the beast was still awake, still hungry. It was the linchpin. As long as that gun was active, we were going nowhere. The ghost, for all his miraculous work, couldn't kill a concrete bunker with a rifle. Sooner or later, a German officer would get his men under control. They would realize the threat in their rear was just one man, and they would turn their full attention back to us. And the pillbox would be the instrument of our destruction. My mind was a battlefield in itself, caught in a crossfire between tactical reality and a truth so absurd it felt like a hallucination. The ping, the sound of the Garand clip ejecting. It echoed in my head, a sound that dismantled my entire understanding of the world. It had to be him. It was impossible, it was ludicrous, but no other explanation fit. Private Daniel Bishop, the freeze-up, the pariah, the preacher's boy I had sent to die, was the ghost in the woods. The guilt was a physical thing now, a cold, heavy weight in my gut. I had sent him on that suicide mission with a sneer on my face, convinced I was culling the herd, sacrificing a weak link to save the strong. I had judged him, condemned him, and written him off. In my arrogance, I had seen him as a simple equation of weakness. I had failed to see the man. I had failed to see the variables of courage and faith that existed outside my brutal, cynical calculus of war. If we died here, My greatest sin wouldn't be leading my men into a trap. It would be my utter, contemptuous failure to recognize the strength of the one man who could have let us out. Frank. Evan's voice was a low whisper beside me. He had crawled back to my position, his face streaked with grime, his eyes hollow. The lieutenant is bad. Real bad. Doc says if we don't get him out of here soon, he's gonna lose the arm. Or worse. We got 5 dead for sure, including Texas. Maybe 8 more wounded who can't fight. We're down to 9 effectives, counting you and me. 9 men. 9 rifles against a fortified position that had already chewed up a full platoon. The numbers were stark. They spelled out our epitaph. And ammo? I asked, my voice flat. Critical. A few clips per man. Rizzo's almost dry on bar mags. I nodded slowly, the information confirming what I already knew. We couldn't fight our way out. We couldn't hold out for much longer. Our only hope was the ghost. Our only hope was the kid I had thrown away. The irony was so thick and bitter I could taste it. Tell the men to stay put, I said. Conserve what they have. No one fires unless they have a clear shot at an officer. What are we waiting for? Evans asked. I looked out into the smoke-shrouded woods, in the direction of the Hogback Ridge. A miracle, I said, the word feeling foreign and foolish on my tongue. And then, through the smoke, I saw a movement. It wasn't the gray uniform of a German soldier. It was the olive drab of an American. A single figure, moving slowly, deliberately, not from the direction of the ridge, but emerging from a shallow ravine that ran perpendicular to the German lines, a dead zone in the crossfire. He was using the thickest plumes of smoke from the burning truck for cover, moving with a patience and purpose that was mesmerizing. He wasn't running. He wasn't crawling. He was just walking. My first thought was that it was a German in a captured uniform, a trick. I raised my rifle, my eyes settling into the rear sight aperture, my finger taking up the slack on the trigger. But the figure was too small, too slight to be one of the well-fed grenadiers we'd been fighting. And he was carrying an M1 Garand. Who the hell is that? Rizzo whispered from his position, his voice tight with disbelief. The figure kept walking, moving deeper into the smoke, getting closer to the German lines, closer to the pillbox. He was walking right into the dragon's mouth. It was suicide. It was the bravest, most insane thing I had ever seen. The smoke swirled, and I lost him for a moment. My heart pounded. Had he been hit? Was he down? Then the smoke parted again, and I saw him. He was closer now, maybe 75 yards from the pillbox. And I could see his face. It was Bishop. A collective gasp went through the trench. The men who could see him stared, their mouths agape. It was like watching a man walk on water. It didn't make sense. The air around him should have been filled with bullets. The MG-42 in the pillbox should have torn him in half. But it remained silent. The German riflemen in their foxholes seemed paralyzed, unwilling to fire, perhaps unsure of what they were seeing, or afraid of drawing the attention of the phantom who had just wrecked their flank. Bishop stopped. He was standing in the open, in the middle of the killing field, a lone, mud-caked figure in a landscape of death. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking up the slope, directly at the narrow firing slit of the concrete pillbox. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there. Then he did something that broke my brain. He called out. His voice, clear and steady, carried across the battlefield in a lull between rifle shots. It was a sound so alien in that place of violence that it seemed to stop time. He wasn't screaming a battle cry. He wasn't yelling threats. He was talking. My name is Private Daniel Bishop. He shouted, his voice strong, without a trace of the tremble I remembered so well. I'm with the 28th Infantry Division of the United States Army. I stared, dumbfounded. What was he doing? Was he trying to surrender? After everything he had done? A German voice, ragged with stress, screamed back from a foxhole near the pillbox. Was Will She's Doc, du idiot. What does he want? Shoot, you idiot. But no one shot. Bishop's lone, defiant stand had created a moment of profound and surreal uncertainty. The battle is over. Bishop called out, his voice ringing with a strange authority. Your position is hopeless. You are surrounded. Your flank is gone. Your communications are cut. Your ammunition is destroyed. He was reciting a simple, brutal list of facts. The facts he had created. The MG-42 in the pillbox traversed slightly, its black barrel pointing directly at him. My heart leaped into my throat. Shoot, kid, I thought, a desperate, silent plea. Dive for cover. Do something. But he just stood there, unflinching, as if the gun held no power over him. I am a man of God. Bishop's voice rang out, and now I could hear the preacher in him, the cadence and the conviction that had been buried so deep. And my God is a God of mercy. But the men I serve with, they are out of mercy. They have lost friends today. If you continue this fight, they will grant you no quarter. They will kill every last one of you. He was lying. We were the ones on the verge of annihilation. But he said it with such absolute conviction that for a moment, I almost believed him myself. But if you lay down your arms now, he continued, his voice softening slightly. If you surrender, I give you my word, as a soldier and as a Christian, that you will be treated with dignity under the rules of the Geneva Convention. You will receive food, water, and medical attention for your wounded. You will survive this day. You will survive this war. It was the most audacious bluff I had ever witnessed. He was offering them terms. A single, mud-soaked private was negotiating the surrender of a fortified enemy position. A long, tense silence followed. The only sound was the crackle of the burning truck. The fate of all of us hung in that silence. The German gunner in the pillbox had a choice. He could pull the trigger and obliterate the strange apparition in front of him, and then turn his gun back on us and finish the job. Or he could believe. I held my breath. Evans was beside me, his rifle forgotten, his face a mask of utter astonishment. The entire war seemed to have paused, holding its breath with us. Then, something white appeared in the firing slit of the pillbox. A piece of cloth, a t-shirt maybe, tied to the barrel of a rifle and slowly, tentatively, pushed outside. A wave of disbelief washed over me, so powerful it almost made me dizzy. It was a flag of surrender. It started a chain reaction. A moment after the white flag appeared on the pillbox, another one popped up from a foxhole to its right. Then another, and another. All across the slope, the fight just evaporated. The German soldiers, they were broken by the chaos, the losses, and now the surrender of their main strongpoint, were giving up. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to emerge from their holes. First one man, then two, then a dozen. They threw their rifles down and raised their hands above their heads. They were young kids, most of them, just as young as Bishop. Their faces were pale, streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound relief. My own men started to climb out of the trench, their movements stiff and uncertain, as if waking from a long nightmare. They stood there, rifles held at the ready, watching the unbelievable scene unfold. The war had stopped. The preacher's son had stopped it. Bishop remained where he was, standing firm, until the German officer in command, a weary-looking lieutenant with a bloody bandage around his head, walked forward and offered Bishop his Luger pistol in a formal gesture of surrender. Bishop just shook his head and gestured for the man to drop it on the ground. Only then did he turn and start walking back towards us. He moved with the same slow, deliberate pace, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The conquering hero returning from the field. He walked through the column of surrendering Germans, who stared at him with a kind of superstitious awe, as if he were not a man at all, but something else entirely. He reached our trench line. His uniform was torn and caked with mud. There was a long scratch down one cheek, beaded with blood. His face was thin, his eyes were sunken from exhaustion and stress, but they were clear. The fear was gone, utterly and completely gone. I was looking at a stranger who wore the face of the boy I had sent to die. He stopped in front of me. The surviving men of the platoon had gathered around, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, overwhelming respect. They parted to let him through. He looked me straight in the eye. There was no accusation in his gaze. No, I told you so. Just a quiet, unshakable certainty. Hill is secure, Sergeant, he said, his voice calm and even. We have approximately 40 to 50 prisoners. Their casualties are significant. I called in on the field phone before I came down. Line was still good. Battalion is sending up support and medical teams. They should be here within the hour. His report was crisp, professional, perfect. He had done his job. The impossible, suicidal job I had given him. He had taken the wire, climbed the ridge, and become our eyes. But he had done more. He had seen our attack fail. He had seen us trapped. And instead of saving himself, he had taken his rifle, his grenades, and his faith, and he had gone to war. I looked at him, at the dirt on his face, at the clarity in his eyes. I tried to find the words to say, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. You saved us. You saved me." But the words wouldn't come. They were too small, too cheap for what he had done. My throat was tight, a knot of shame, guilt, and a respect so profound it felt like an earthquake in my soul. I had seen countless acts of bravery in this war. I had seen men charge machine gun nests and jump on grenades. But I had never seen anything like this. This was courage of a different kind. It wasn't about the willingness to kill. It was about the willingness to walk into the valley of the shadow of death armed with nothing but words and conviction and bring everyone, friend and foe alike, out alive. So I did the only thing I could. I looked him up and down, taking in the soldier who stood before me, the man he had become in the crucible of that forest. And I gave him a short, sharp nod. It was more than a gesture. It was a surrender. My surrender. An acknowledgement that my brutal world of cynical survival had been defeated by something I didn't even believe in. A small, weary smile touched Bishop's lips. He understood. He nodded back. Later that evening, after the medics had taken our wounded and the MPs had marched the prisoners away, the 9 of us who were left sat around a small, smokeless fire, huddled together for warmth. We were wrapped in wool blankets, sipping hot coffee from our canteen cups that the relief force had brought up. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. We had survived. That was enough. Bishop was sitting a little apart from the others, staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. The other men kept glancing at him, their expressions a mix of reverence and wonder. He was one of them now, but he was also something more. He was the man who had talked the guns to sleep. I got up and walked over to him. I sat down in the mud beside him. For a long moment, we just watched the fire together. Then, I unscrewed the cap from my canteen. It wasn't coffee. It was a shot of captured German schnapps I'd been saving for a special occasion. I took a short pull, the raw liquor burning a welcome trail down my throat. Then I held the canteen out to him. He looked at the canteen, then at me. His eyes were old, ancient. He had seen the face of God today, or the devil, or maybe both. "I don't drink, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Tonight." "You do, son," I said, my voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "That's an order." He hesitated for a second, then took the canteen. He lifted it, his hand steady, and took a drink. He coughed, his eyes watering from the raw spirit, but he didn't complain. He handed it back to me. We sat there in silence for another minute, sharing the quiet communion. The war was still all around us, and tomorrow there would be another hill, another town, another battle. But something had changed today. I had changed. I had sent a lamb to the slaughter, and he had come back a lion. Not a lion who roared and killed, but one whose quiet strength could tame the savagery of men. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone and warmed me to the soul, that I would follow him into any hell this war could dream up, and I would call it an honor.